It came out that Pawel was interviewed by police on July 12th. That was an 8-hour interview. Pawel had claimed that the last time he spoke with Fotis in person was a week after Jennifer's disappearance. And that was Pawel's last day of work. And it came out under questioning that Pawel just didn't show up for work. He didn't tell Fotis he quit. He just didn't show up. And Pawel filed for unemployment insurance. When he filled out the form, what he claimed was that there was a temporary shutdown. During Pawel's interview, Pawel told police he couldn't give details on his whereabouts on May 24th. Pawel had told police he couldn't recall. Now, the prosecution is objecting to this, and the prosecution kept objecting and was overruled. It's very interesting that as of July 12th, 2019, Pawel can't remember where he was on May 24th or what was going on, what he was doing. He can't give details of things, but now he remembers really clearly. This is years later. The defense kept trying to get out of Pawel the fact that the police pressed him and the police didn't believe him. And the prosecution kept objecting. Anyway, eventually he got it out. And the question was essentially, didn't the police let you know that they didn't believe you, that you couldn't recall? Pawel on the stand said he didn't recall that either. The defense points out that Pawel did recall telling police that Fotis had a scheduled meeting at the office with a lawyer. Michelle had said exactly this in her statement, that she believed that Fotis had a meeting with Kent. She saw Kent and she assumed, well, then Fotis must be meeting with Kent. Pawel's previous testimony was that he was at a job site in New Canaan from 10 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. It takes him about an hour and 20 minutes to get from his home to this job site. The defense challenges him and says, you weren't there all that time, were you? And the defense pushed Pawel on whether or not he had lunch. And Pawel saying, well, maybe it's possible. He's hedging all over the place. Okay, where'd you have lunch? Well, maybe it was this Chinese restaurant. But Pawel can't remember really where he had lunch, if he had lunch somewhere else, what time it might have been. He just couldn't recall. Defense asks, you were not at that job site with any 4-group vehicle, were you? Pawel doesn't answer. And the prosecution was on his feet. And the defense couldn't even get a question out of his mouth because the prosecution's objecting. And the judge says, look, I haven't even heard the question. What's the objection? There was surveillance across the street from the job site that Pawel said that he was at on the day of the crime. A 4-group vehicle that Pawel drove was caught on video pretty much every day at this job site, parked in the same location, but not on May 24th. In fact, there was no vehicle at all parked at that job site at the time that Pawel says he was there. Defense asks, you sent a text to Fotis at 2:12 saying that you were still at this job site, yeah? Pawel doesn't recall. Defense, didn't you leave at 12:30 and then never went back? Pawel is just sinking in his seat and says, yes. But then he says, well, but I thought I went back. Well, the prosecution objects to this as well. This isn't good for him. His witness isn't looking good here. The defense was about to use a document that showed the location of the Raptor. And the prosecution was not happy about this and wanted a sidebar. So everything had to stop. After the sidebar, the defense ended up showing Pawel this document that showed the location of the Raptor. It shows that he left the job site, but Pawel still says, even after reading it, but I came back, but I'm not sure. And he doesn't remember the lunch, the server. He doesn't know what street this restaurant is on. He doesn't know if he did anything else in New Canaan. He doesn't remember anything about it. And that's real convenient. And although you can see where the defense is going, the prosecution is objecting. And the judge at one point finally said, look, you're asking this litany of questions about this Chinese restaurant. I mean, that ground has been plowed. The defense moves to the Shell station in Farmington, where Pawel said he gassed up the Raptor at 4:33 p.m. He went then to 4 Jefferson Crossing and saw a phone. And Pawel said, well, he didn't know if it was Fotis's phone or not. Pawel went up to the office and didn't see his keys for the Tacoma. Then he went to Deercliff, and the defense went on about how Deercliff was situated, and he was talking about the view. And you know, I think this is important. Remember earlier in the trial, he threw up that drone footage of the whole area, and it seems important to him whether somebody turned right or left and which side they approached something on. And now he's talking about this view. Well, one thing I've learned about this defense attorney is even when he's saying something or asking something that sounds like it might be irrelevant or dumb, this guy is no dummy. He's always doing something. He is always going somewhere. He is always planting or watering seeds. He is getting little tidbits of information and putting them all in his pockets. So the fact that the property at Deercliff has a view of the valley, I think at some point is going to be useful for the defense. At the very least, he's putting that little tidbit, that admission, in his pocket, just in case. Remember, Pawel said he went and got that 2x10 board, and he put it in the Raptor, and then he went to Mountain Springs. And the defense said, well, why did you bring the board to Mountain Springs? And Pawel doesn't really explain. He didn't really have an answer. And then he says, well, the reason he went to Mountain Springs was to see what? The defense moves on. Pawel had described all this back and forth between Mountain Springs and Deercliff and Jefferson Crossing. And I mean, it's enough to make your head spin. And some of it wasn't quite hanging together. Some of it didn't quite make sense why you would do all that. But, you know, that's his testimony. So now the defense is asking questions. Why did you bring the board to Mountain Springs? And then he moves on. But this is going to come up again. Question. You said you never saw Michelle clean before. And now Pawel's not sure. And the defense brings out the fact that actually when there's a showing on a house, everybody cleans. Everybody gets involved. Even Fotis has cleaned. And Pawel agrees, yeah, he's seen Fotis clean. And the defense rattled off names of a number of people who worked there. And yeah, they've all cleaned. Pawel has cleaned. It's a thing that happens. But Pawel will not agree to recalling seeing Michelle clean. And the reason I'm stressing those words is because we have seen Pawel kind of split hairs. Well, I didn't tell the truth because nobody asked me. I omitted an entire afternoon because nobody asked me when actually they had, but they didn't ask the right way. So we know Pawel does that. So when he says something like that he won't agree to recalling seeing Well, it's suspect, right? The defense asked if seeing Fotis at Mountain Springs was planned or unplanned. Pawel agrees that this was not planned ahead. So then that means that for Michelle and Fotis to look at Pawel with any expression of surprise, like, oh, you're here, would not be an unusual thing or signal anything nefarious. It would be a normal reaction. The defense proceeded to ask questions that elicited answers from Pawel that basically reinforced that, well, everything was normal. Michelle and Fotis were acting normal. Now, just because somebody's acting normal doesn't mean they haven't done anything, but that's another conversation. They didn't try to get rid of Pawel. Weren't trying to hide anything. Pawel saw no bags of garbage. He saw no towels rolled up. He saw no rolled up carpets or mats or anything like that. Pawel says he never went inside the house at 80 Mountain Springs. And the defense goes back to this issue of cleaning. He does this a lot. He'll go get on a subject. He sort of drops it for a while and they move on to something else and then come back to it. So now he's back on the cleaning. And he's saying, well, in these properties after constructions, there's a lot of dust, right? And Pawel agrees. And Pawel has seen Fotis clean before. Then it was brought out that it was windy on May 24th, that Fotis had a housekeeper, that Pawel even conversed with this housekeeper in Polish. But this housekeeper was just for the home, the residential home at Jefferson Crossing. She wasn't somebody who would go and clean the other properties. The defense circles back around to reinforce that Pawel left in the Raptor. Fotis and Michelle were in the Suburban and in the Jeep. So it's not like Fotis and Michelle were staying behind for some extended period of time or anything. So Pawel, though, again, went to Deercliff. And the defense asked, why are you carting this 2x10 around? I mean, you've got the 2x10. You are thinking that you're going to put it in your Tacoma, yet you've got it in the Raptor and you're driving back and forth to all these places. Why didn't you just unload this 2x10 and put it in your Tacoma if the plan was for you to take the Tacoma and take the dirt bike in your Tacoma? And Pawel didn't really have an answer. He asked Pawel, did you put anything in the Raptor at 80 Mountain Springs? The answer is no. Did Fotis or Michelle put anything in the Raptor at 80 Mountain Springs? The answer was no. The defense brought out the fact that Pawel said she had to meet somebody about rugs. Then Pawel leaves and he assumed that Michelle took the Tacoma key. Pawel and Fotis end up back at 80 Mountain Springs. When Pawel said, look, I need my key, Fotis didn't object. And he said, well, you can take the Raptor. And Pawel, he wants his Tacoma. So Pawel takes the Tacoma to Deercliff. Well, there's so much back and forth, yeah? The defense asks, okay, now where is this 2x10 board that you've been carting around in the Raptor? Where's the 2x10? Well, Pawel answers at Deercliff, because he took it out and put it at the side of the building. Then Pawel says he left the Tacoma at Deercliff, got into the Raptor with Fotis to go to Fort Jefferson. He charged up the dirt bike and drove it back to Deercliff to take it home. He said when he loaded his dirt bike into the Tacoma, there was still nothing in the bed of the truck except what he had left there, the bungee cords and the tie downs for the bike. There were no bags, no tools, no garbage bags. And Pawel didn't notice any blood or stains or anything unusual. There was nothing out of place. On Sunday, May 26th and 27th, it's reaffirmed that Pawel was not at work, but Fotis called on the weekend to say that Jennifer is missing. Defense asked Pawel if anyone had alerted him to the fact that Jennifer disappeared before Fotis did. And Pawel says yes, Stefan did. He texted him. And now Pawel's saying, well, he doesn't actually recall searching for news stories about Jennifer. The defense tried to bring out that Pawel did not believe that anything awful had happened to Jennifer, that Pawel believed, like other people believed, she's not really missing, she's either run off or it's something else, right? Well, the prosecution didn't like this, so there was objection. And the defense was not allowed to go any further than that. Pawel was asked when he noticed the bucket with the sweatshirt in it. The defense is walking on thin ice here. He has to be so careful about how he words everything in this area because of the previous stipulation. Pawel says it was a light blue jacket, so it was not navy blue. Pawel says he hadn't seen it before the Tuesday. He noticed no stains or blood, like it didn't look like it came from a crime scene. And I note that all of this, the truck being empty, the noticing the bucket, all of it is before the Tacoma was washed. And the defense brings this out. The morning of the 27th at the house with Michelle and Fotis, Pawel had told Fotis he didn't need a timeline because he remembered. He knew what he was doing on the 24th. He knew what he was doing on the 24th. He didn't need a timeline. But then after that, he couldn't remember. And he told police, I can't remember because it was an ordinary day. And he also was saying that he didn't remember back then things that had happened only 3 days after the day in question. So somehow his memory has improved vastly. The defense wants to bring up the day the truck was cleaned, and the prosecution objected. The objection was overruled, and Pawel says that he thinks the truck was cleaned after that Tuesday. And then Pawel says he can't recall because the police have his phone. The defense got Pawel to basically reiterate that even after he discovered that Fotis had his truck cleaned, he didn't suspect anything. The defense asked about how Pawel had gone to these junkyards and he did in fact find one that had Tacoma seats available, but those seats wouldn't be available for a couple of days. Pawel decided not to purchase those seats. And when that testimony first came out, I thought, well, that's interesting that there they are available, but he continues to run around and go to so much effort to continue to try and look for seats and then ultimately go and get these Porsche seats that didn't fit, and then he was struggling with them and all of this. If the issue was he didn't want to do it, he didn't want to actually change the seats, he's still going to an awful lot of effort, and he still did it. And it required more effort than it would have just to get these seats ordered. So I thought, maybe he's in a hurry to get these seats changed. Maybe Pawel's in a hurry to get the seats changed. Maybe he didn't want to wait the 2 days. But, that's not what he says. So the defense sort of brought this out a little bit. Then he said, when you told Fotis you couldn't find seats, you were lying to Fotis. And Pawel says, yes, he was. And he asked, was Fotis angry? Did he yell at you? And Pawel said, no, not at that point. He was annoyed, but he didn't start getting really upset until Pawel said, well, I'm not going to do it. The defense brought up the issue of the use of the word hardware instead of seats. Pawel testified that it was at this point that he thought that was strange. So the car wash wasn't strange, changing the seats wasn't strange, but referring to them as hardware instead of seats, that was weird. But even though he was suspicious, he still didn't believe that Fotis did anything. He was asked about Fotis's explanation about having hugged Jennifer and maybe there was a hair on one of the seats. And Pawel said he thought that was a reasonable explanation for why Fotis would get his truck cleaned. But he didn't think it was a reasonable explanation for changing the seats out. Then the defense questioned Pawel about the day he was in the Jeep and he'd gone to the job site in New Canaan, and then he spent the afternoon running around looking for seats, and then he went and got the Porsche seats, and now he's at Jefferson Crossing and the police are there. Even after the conversation that Pawel had with police, he still changed those seats. He knows the police are interested. He knows something's up, but he changed those seats anyway. The defense asked Pawel, did anyone ever tell you that one of your hairs was found in a cleaning sponge? And Pawel said no, he didn't know that. Even though Pawel's hair was found in this trash along with all the other things that they found, no one has really brought this up again. So there are unanswered questions about that. Pawel did say today on cross that the prosecution asked him, did you at any time have one of these sponges in your truck? Well, the answer was no. Pawel never had such a sponge in his truck. The defense moved to the Sunday after the 24th and said to Pawel, well, isn't it true on the Sunday after Jennifer disappeared, you were searching for flights to Krakow, Poland? Well, the prosecution objected to this. The defense brings out that on Sunday, May 26, some of the searches were deleted from Pawel's phone. And Pawel said he had no idea how that happened. Now, if you clear your search history, it clears your search history. So why would only some of them be missing? The defense said to Pawel, before you made your written statement to police, didn't the police say to you, come on, you have to pick a team? And then they made you afraid about your green card? And Pawel doesn't really actually answer. His answer is, well, they told me I have to tell them what I know. But that wasn't what the defense was really going after. The police were saying, you gotta pick a side. And that is not something wrong that the police are doing. But I think the defense was just trying to pull out of him this idea that he's under a lot of pressure and he has to pick a side. So he's got to pick between Fotis, who he's, 1 minute he says he's a nice guy and then the next minute he's kind of a tyrant and goes after people and that sort of thing. So Pawel's in a bad spot, right? So Pawel has to pick a side while the police are going to have a whole lot of power when it comes to his immigration status. So he has motive to pick a team. The defense got into, well, the police asked you if, in hindsight, you thought anything was strange or suspicious, and you brought up this conversation that Fotis had with the media guy where he was asking about cameras around Jennifer's house. And Pawel said, yes, that's true. And really, I get where you could go with this, but that is a normal question from police and it's reasonable. It would be a failure for them to not ask that question. Also, there are countless times when people witness things and they don't understand in the moment what it is that they're actually witnessing. And sometimes people will have some detail that they know that they think is not important, but that detail could be the key to unraveling a case that's outstanding. So that question and the answer are normal. It's also normal for somebody to think nothing of something at the time, and then later when they have more information, they go back and think, oh, wait a minute, in light of this new information, now that thing seems suspicious. So I don't think the defense scored anything right there. Then the defense asks, isn't it true you admitted to police that you took the license plates off of the Raptor? So eventually Pawel agrees that, yeah, he said that. Then the defense asked about the bicycle. It was a racing bike with skinny tires. It was an old bicycle. And at the time, all Pawel really knew about it was that it was a French-made bicycle. On redirect, prosecution brings up this issue of the dirt bike. Fotis was purchasing a dirt bike and was going to get money for a trade-in. And so he offered to sell the bike to Pawel for $1,800. They negotiated, but Michelle still had a loan on this bike and she was still paying off this loan. The title, I guess the full title wasn't released to her or something. And so Pawel never got the title on the bike. The prosecution wanted to play a clip of Michelle's interview with the police for the witness. This is unusual. The defense says, what? I object to that. That's not the way things work. And the prosecution and the defense argue. And ultimately the court allows it. They just show the interview where Michelle said to police, yes, and I sold this bike to Pawel. So first it looked bad for Pawel. Then it looks bad for Michelle, but there's more coming. The prosecution has an exhibit that the defense knows nothing about. And the prosecution says, well, I just got it last night. And the defense is like, what? Like, I need to at least hear it before you put it in. So they take a 5-minute break so they can listen to it. Well, the exhibit was a voicemail from Farmington police left on Pawel's voicemail saying, Michelle Troconis, you have this bike belonging to Michelle Troconis. She wants it back. I'd really like to just contact you so that we can handle this civilly. So the point being that, look, we're not interested in charging you or anything like that, but we need to work this out. Well, it comes out then that Michelle had not been paid for the bike. So Fotis took Pawel's money, if it's true that Pawel paid for it, and I don't see anything that says that he didn't. Fotis took the money, and who knows if he gave it to Michelle or not. Anyway, she wanted her bike back, and all this happened, so this all gets put in front of the jury. Pawel's out his money. So no matter who jerked him around, he got jerked around. We're still on redirect, and the prosecution moves on to the Tacoma keys. Pawel says the reason he thought Michelle took the key is because it was sticking out of the truck door. The prosecution gets Pawel to reiterate earlier testimony that Fotis told Pawel not to mention anything about Michelle having the key. This didn't clarify anything. This didn't rebut anything. This was the prosecution cleverly injecting a place where he could repeat a point that he wants the jury to hear. So they won't forget this. And so now they won't forget this. All this about the key is suspect because Michelle in her interview said, oh, well, I had to get the vacuum and then the vacuum wasn't going to work because it wasn't central vac. And so I had to go back. So it was weird. She was explaining this back and forth. Well, if she's explaining that back and forth, why is she not explaining the back and forth about the key? So it seems to me that pretty much everybody in this is omitting things in an attempt to redeem Pawel a little bit. The prosecution asks, well, maybe you were researching flights to Poland for somebody? And Pawel says, yes, for his wife and kids. But you didn't jump on a plane and fly to Poland, did you? And Pawel says, no, he didn't. On the 23rd, Pawel didn't remember which day he went to the Chinese restaurant. The prosecution asked him, why did you remove the Raptor plates? And yeah, like everybody wants to know. Pawel says it's because Fotis had run into something and Pawel needed to straighten the bumper, so he had to take off the license plate to do that. The defense gets up again and asks, this Tacoma key is sticking out of the door. You see it sticking out of the door of the truck. Was anything stopping you from just going and getting that key? You're leaving. Was anything stopping you from taking that key? And the answer is no, there was nothing stopping him from doing that. He said, well, I thought I'd be back in 5 minutes. The defense brought out again, and Pawel said this before. Actually, Pawel said this to both sides, which is, he thought that Michelle grabbed the key because she didn't want to leave the truck like that, with the key sticking out of the door, which seems reasonable. I think both sides are starting to weave together all these bits of information that have been thrown out there. We'll see how it goes. That's all I've got for you today. Trust your gut. I'll see you in the comments.